Our agenda for the afternoon is to present a model for improving inclusive practices that we've developed in our early intervention special education program at Cal State Fullerton. We're going to share some professional development, practical collaborations between general and special education preschool teachers, and then we're going to do a little activity around universal design for learning. Not that many of you need that refresher, I don't know, but more to just show you what some of the activities are that we do around issues and challenges for shared knowledge building and coming together. So that's pretty much the agenda for the afternoon.
And we wanted to start by knowing who's with us today. How do you want to do that? Do you want to ask about roles?
Yeah, maybe just briefly your name and where you're coming from here. Like, what's your role? Teacher,
administrator,
student.
Yes. How many teachers do we have in the room? And how about administration, district or program admin? And who are we missing?
Higher ed.
Higher ed? Anyone from higher ed?
Hey, Amber.
Hey, you guys should talk. How cute.
All right.
They're both.
You're both due. Okay.
All right. Well, it's really interesting that was mentioned right away. I take it my mic needs. Hello? Is this okay?
Okay.
This isn't working anyway, but okay. Sorry about that.
If we have any the folks introduce themselves, if you could pass that around.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so I don't need this. Oh,
Okay.
good. All right. Really interesting, as I was saying this morning, how discussion came up, or the mention came up, of how this is a community of practice. And, you know, I'm not the quickest person to catch on to things, so I was like, oh, I thought that too. And it was so funny because here we are preparing our presentation on communities of practice, and I didn't realize that beforehand that that's what this was. And I was thinking, man, this is a community of practice. We're engaging in what we're talking about. And then it was like, yeah, that was on purpose. Oh, okay. So I'm a little bit slower to put all the pieces together, but just to define it, we have here a definition from Wenger, and that's groups of people who share a concern of a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. And then communities of practice are formed by people who engage in a process of collective learning in a shared domain. Critical features of communities of practice. So we really are just trying to figure out what it is before we discuss how we're trying to explore that and do that at the teacher preparation level, and how you might do that wherever you are, even starting right here in this room. So there's three critical features. The domain, where members share the interest or mutual engagement, it's called in other places. Community, members engage in joint activities and discussions, or also called joint enterprise. And practice, members are practitioners that share a repertoire of resources. They have a shared practice. Okay, so you'll see that's exactly what we're doing here at this conference for these days. Now, in terms of what kind of activities communities of practice engage in, the first is problem solving. For example, and this also is from Wenger, someone saying, can you brainstorm with me? I'm stuck. Okay, so we have now dialogue, right? Some problem solving around that. The second one is requests for information. Where can I find that form? Seeking experience. Have you ever worked with a paraprofessional like this before? Reusing assets. You can look at the letter I sent home to parents last year and use it as a template. Coordination and synergy. For example, can we pull our resources together for toys that are more conducive to social facilitation between the kiddos with disabilities and those without? Discussing developments. What do you think of the new curriculum we're being asked to implement? Documentation projects. This behavior is becoming an issue. Let's collect data and write up a report. Visits. Can I come observe your classroom? And mapping knowledge and identifying gaps. we've got these aspects covered, but who can we connect with for help with that? Okay. The communities of practice framework really is where learning is bidirectional, okay? Learning is viewed as distributed among many participants within the community in which people with diverse expertise, from experts to novices and everyone in between, are transformed through their own actions and those of other participants. So you can just see the exchange, the collaboration, the joint activities and actions that are taken by a group. So, communities of practice is a promising approach for engaging stakeholder groups in collaboratively solving complex and often persistent problems in special ed. And this is from Cashman et al., and they're specifically speaking of communities of practice as it relates to special education. And so, really, we can use these to help solve complex problems, promote the spread of best practices, which would close that research to practice gap we're always having to deal with, develop members' professional skills, and help recruit and retain talent, which is another one that the research, there's many reasons for why we see research to practice gap, and one of those we see all the time, or it's brought up all the time by our candidates. We're in teacher preparation, and we're talking about all this stuff, inclusion, and these kinds of practices, but then they go out and they don't necessarily see what we're teaching, and we're having, obviously, to do a number of different things in partnership with the community through communities of practice and many different things to sort of bridge that gap, close that gap. One of the reasons the gap exists, one proposed reason is that we're not keeping the talent in the field. It's all the attrition and the turnover and all those other things. So there's many reasons to explain it, but communities of practice is one way that we can address even that. Okay.
So specifically in our teacher training program, we're really working on this, exploring a general education, special education community of practice model. We want to be able to promote professional development for both early childhood teachers and early childhood pre-service teachers in inclusive practices. So this exploration has been set within the context of our federally funded early childhood special education grant programs, iDream and STAR. They're both federally funded Office of Special Education Program personnel prep grants, and they were written specifically to help train teachers, early childhood special education teachers, to be inclusion specialists or more knowledgeable. iDream is a really long acronym because we love acronyms, and I wrote this grant in 2009. I still cannot remember it, but it's something about inclusive, developmentally responsible early education, access to
You have it in here.
meaningful something. I have it in there. And STAR is supporting teacher advancement and retention. So that's the context of the two different grants. So one of the things that the literature had told us was that we do a pretty good job in special education training our teachers for intervention, but not necessarily always what's developmentally appropriate, because we're so focused on the special education, the discrete trials, the positive behavior support, positioning, which are all really important. All those things are important, but if they're going to go and work in a blended program, an inclusive program, the myriad of programs out there that call themselves inclusive, how will they know how to support children within that setting? What do they know about good early childhood programs? What do they know about learning foundations? Good teaching is good teaching, and then we should layer those interventions. So that was my thinking when I wrote the first grant. And in that grant, we did a community of practice with general ed in that the students had an extra practicum that they had to do in a general education setting. So on top of all the other practicums that we had them do in our program, they have a certain amount of hours, birth through 3, and then 3 to 5-year-olds. Then we also asked them after this year of special training to go out and act as an inclusion collaborative or consultative member of the team to really get the idea of how teamwork and how that co-teaching should happen. Oh, you already did from me. Oh, awesome. So Project STAR, our objectives were also to develop coursework and curriculum and field experiences with the emphasis on evidence-based practice and training of all these different areas. Some of the things that we put in grants are specific things that the federal government wants us to do, and then it's sort of tweaking them so that we get to do what we want to do with them. So Amber knows that. So we're working with young English language learners, providing effective instruction and collaboration models in the natural environment and inclusive settings, and providing training to ECSE teachers and general education preschool teachers in social facilitation and joint attention. It's just one of the things we're doing, and other ways to support successful inclusion. So that's the gist of Project STAR. Granted, we have these grants to help make this community a practice, but the desire was that we bring these two groups together. So here's sort of just the back-to-back of what we accomplished in iDream, it's finished, and what we're doing in Project STAR. We're specifically fostering that collaboration to support inclusion through specific strategies, and that's one of the things we'll be sharing with you. And the reason why we're doing this is for these reasons that we found in the literature and what we're hearing from our students who have graduated and gone out into the field and had those aha moments like, oh, a lack of skills in collaboration. So one of the things that we have found from the literature and from our students is that being a collaborator and being a consultant are not that easy tasks to do. We all come in with a set of knowledge, and that's a big barrier. Sometimes the early childhood teacher feels threatened by the special education teacher. Sometimes the special education teacher really isn't sure what's going on and not familiar with different curriculums. And so what happens is their relationship, and we've heard multiple times today throughout our sessions that it's all about relationships. And their relationship impedes the child getting access to what they want to do. And so, we talk about building skills and collaboration, and then always focusing on the child and the child's needs. There's also, we found some differences in core knowledge and philosophy between ECSE and ECE. Just the kinds of theories and the different curriculums that they have. We found that some of the Head Start, some of the state preschools, some of the districts have different rules that make it harder to collaborate. Maybe we have too many kids already, we can't all be out on the playground at the same time. The state has differences in Title 22 and Title 5 that even make who can work with who. So a teacher with an early childhood special education credential and a master's has been told, well, you don't have a child development certificate, so you can't work with general ed children. And then I'm thinking, well, but the general ed teacher, the early childhood teacher, doesn't have as many units. Why do they get to work with our special ed students? I mean, it's crazy. So within that, those things aren't changing anytime soon. So we have to kind of do some grassroots work, and that's kind of the way we are working. And then that providing appropriate and effective supports. It was mentioned in the keynote speaker, the dump and hope sort of thing, like what supports are actually out there. I just got back from Romania and Bulgaria, and they have an integrated model, but integration means you just kind of put the child there and hope that they make it. And sometimes that happens for our kiddos too. So what do we do around all these things? So these are some of the outcomes that we have talked about: the use of responsive instructional practices, a universal design for learning, collaborative consultation models, and also fostering that disposition towards inclusion. Something that Suzanne and I have done, and we did a lot of training in iDream around that, is that unless there's a shared definition of inclusion within a team or within a community of practice, it's going to be hard to move forward, because we could have you sit now and come up with all your definitions, and they may not all be the same. So people have maybe had bad experiences with inclusion because a child was just dumped in their classroom. Some people may be afraid of it. Some people may feel like they don't have the lack of experience. So we really need to tease out and discuss, like, what are our dispositions to inclusion. So that is actually one of the first things that we do when we're bringing people together in a community of practice, so that we're all talking about the same thing at the same time.
It really is one of our first activities when we have a community of practice, or whatever sort of way we're pulling people together to share and collaborate. It's getting a shared language. Every single group we've done this with, we have seen that everybody's sort of coming to the table with a different definition. And we do it around inclusion a lot, because that's what we're working with a lot. But what we do see is we'll do an exercise, and we'll put up on the board, everybody's sort of definitions of inclusion, what inclusion is and what inclusion is not. And the things we get are phenomenal. And so if you're sitting at a table arguing about inclusion, it could just be you're saying the same word, but you're thinking two different things. And so if we would first have a shared language, then we'd probably skip half of those battles that we're in. We'd prevent a lot of misunderstanding. And just as you said, we don't know from someone else's past what has been tagged onto that word, what inclusion that term has become to that person based on the experience they had. So if we can sort of find that out about each other and lay those things on the table, we can actually see that, wow, you had a really bad experience. That wasn't inclusion, So, then that gets that. And so this is what we'll all agree when we say inclusion. This is what we'll all agree that inclusion is, and this is what it's not. So really important.
What was the assignment we just had our students do?
Where
they had to interview people out in the community?
Oh, so we, Janice and I were hired together, and it was so funny because when we were hired, they had us share an office, okay, which was like, oh, I'm so sorry, here we're hiring you, and you're supposed to be, our new professors and all this stuff, and yeah, we don't have any space for you to each have your own office, so can you guys share? And it was like, that's fine, low man on the totem pole. And it was like going to college, because it was like our first day, and I was like, oh, I hope she's nice, I hope we like each other, all this stuff. And the first day we started talking, and talk about, it's like Whit said, I'm the behaviorist and she's the, developmentalist. And we're like, ooh, that's gonna go interesting. But the way we understand our two sort of approaches, they fit so well together. It's amazing, and we wouldn't know that. We're like, that's why we get along. And it was just so funny, because in those early days of us sharing an office, it actually lent itself to all these kinds of discussions. The time that you just don't have to hash stuff out and to share ideas and to, well, what do you mean by this? Well, how do you think that works? And we developed a shared language. One of those ideas that sparked from the first time, that first sharing of the office experience, was this dream that we would be able to have in a class on inclusion in our teacher preparation program. And for the first time, we're running that right now, which is like perfect that we're here, because we're thinking, oh, this student, we got to send this back, we've got to post this. So it's really wonderful to be here at the same time as we're doing that. But one of the assignments that we've given them, one of the earliest assignments, was to identify a team, where the student is fully included, or to the greatest extent possible, and interview 3 different members on that team. So a parent, an administrator, a teacher, a paraprofessional, whatever, and interview them these 6 or so questions. You know, what is inclusion? What's the criteria for one to be included or not? And all these kinds of questions. And it was just so fascinating for the students to see for themselves. Number one, they learned all about exploring those issues and the importance of shared language and how parents may see that different from professionals, et cetera. And it was funny because we would have administrator responses that were very legal. And, you know, and then you'd have teacher responses, which were very educational, and you had parent responses, which were very ethical. And it was just interesting. And then they all came back, and we shared as a class, and then they learned from everybody else's. So it was just a really wonderful activity. But it just pointed to the same thing we've found over and over, is that people really do define this differently, and they're talking about it from their own personal experience, and just how important that really was.
So then, as far as collaboration and consultation, we're looking at successful inclusive practices require collaboration between class teacher and the wider school community, including support and the specialists that are there, as well as the parents and the caregivers. And that teachers require knowledge, understanding, and skills and access to resources, including specialized staff, to work with diverse set of pupils that are found in the inclusive setting. So from the research, we know that this has to happen at some point. Is that me?
Yeah, why don't you do this one? Okay, yeah, let's talk about our model. You want to start with the members?
Yeah. So I'll go back a little bit. So for Project STAR, we wrote in the grant that we would bring in early childhood teachers out in the field with several partner schools, and we have high-need partner schools, Santa Ana, Unified, and Anaheim. Also our Children's Center on campus, which has struggled also to make sure that all children are included from the staff and faculty at Cal State Fullerton, and Fullerton Community College Lab School. They are partners and lent us letters of support so that their staff would have the opportunity to come in when we were running seminars for our grant scholars, our grant students, and they would get a stipend and be able to attend the same conferences so that they were part of the team. So the thinking was that in part of our community of practice, that the early childhood teachers would be hearing the same thing as our ECSE teachers. So trying to break that silo a little bit and making our early childhood teachers understand that we value them enough to bring them in, to give them a stipend, to make them part of the team. So on our university side in our community, so we identified who needs to be there as far as the parameters of our institution and grant, was faculty, so both early childhood special ed and early intervention faculty who have specialties in inclusion, like Suzanne. We have early literacy, so one of our reading faculty in our Department of Reading who specializes in early literacy and family literacy and EL. She's part of our team. We have another faculty member in the Department of Special Ed who does a lot of work around diversity. So they're part of our team. And then we have our pre-service teachers who are part of our scholars. And every year, each cohort is sort of our guinea pig cohort, so we tweak things as it goes about. Out of our first grant, iDream, we got our inclusion class. We instituted some other assignments into student teaching that we found worked as we went through. And then our local community, our administrators from Head Start. We have an administrator from Santa Ana who specializes in assistive technology and special ed services, and he's there as well. Our preschool director at Cal State Fullerton as part of our team, and then the early childhood preschool teachers out in the community who come in for trainings as well. So that's kind of our main core group, so that In our definition early on, you saw that it's bringing people together with different specialties who can all work together. So part of, if you're setting up or thinking about setting up a community of practice, you want to identify who you might need to join that group at this point.
Also, in the definition was, including people with little experience, no experience, all the way up. And so you can see there are different specialists on the team, but there are also in the community, and there are also pre-service teachers, and they don't know too much yet, and you also see general ed in these activities, because we're kind of preaching to the choir most of the time. But how do we get in the same room and have these same discussions and joint activities with general ed? So that's kind of neat.
I also wanted to mention that on our advisory board, we have former teachers from our program who are graduated, who are out in the field, families of children with special needs who are older and younger in there. So they also come together. They may not come to all the seminars that we have because their time just isn't, they got other things to do on the weekends, as I would like to do. But they are there at our advisory board meetings, and we give them updates. And then as we move through different programs, we ask them what they think about what we're doing and what we need to add and not add. So they are also a voice in there.
So in terms of the critical features that we went over, the mutual engagement or interest of this community of practice is quality inclusive preschool programs for young children, for all young children. The joint enterprise, we engage in discussions and activities surrounding specific issues like universal design for learning, assistive tech, communication strategies, teaching children language and communication strategies, working with children in underserved communities. So you'll see, as you know, and as you'll see, they're always around the issues, and that's when it's just floating. When you try to have a group that's sort of floating under a big, broad banner, it works a little differently or doesn't work as well as when you're really surrounding the group, like a task force, around the issues that are pertinent and important to everyone involved. And then our shared repertoire and practice, really we share resources with each other and strategies to improve practice. It's not all, we're going to teach you, sit down and listen like you're right now. Sorry.
Yeah, it's not like
It's
this.
really not like that. It's much more of an exchange. As you know from this conference, people getting together from all different areas and sharing resources, and obviously all the presenters as much want to hear back from everyone who just happens to not be presenting, but you could, So really what we're finding and trying to do is that we're bringing this group together to understand the experiences of each other in the community and in the classroom, create a joint focus on the outcomes of children and families in terms of, well, let's start with what we have in common, what's similar across the board, and then just recognizing that good teaching is good teaching. It's pretty universal. So how can we see, okay, here's where we're overlapping. That would be helpful. That's critical for, let's say, this population, but it's actually even helpful for that population. So how about we all just decide, we're going to go ahead and adopt that and incorporate it and those kinds of things. Yes?
When you had discussions and activities, did you draw those topics from the group?
We actually started, yes, our initial meeting was more of an advisory board meeting, but we had most of the members, except the students weren't there, but most of the other community members got together, and in those discussions, we really made it more of a forum, a community of practice, and we said, here's the grant. Now, what do we all need to do to prepare our teachers, pre-service and currently working in the classroom? And we literally, it was like a big brainstorming session.
Were the preschool teachers there too to give input?
They were to, if I'm remembering correctly, they were to give them to the director who was coming to that. Mm-hmm. But definitely you would do that. Right. And she represented, and knowing what they ask for, and based on her observations, what they need, and these kinds of things. So initially, we didn't start that way, but you definitely could. That's the goal, right? And so, but we did because we were focused on the central issues, and because it was definitely a shared, thing, a shared interest. We had buy-in. Okay, so it wasn't like, let us into your classroom, you need help.
Right.
But, this is such a wonderful opportunity for us to come together and figure out how we're going to implement universal design for learning. How do we do that? What does that look like? And that comes to right here. So these are sort of the things that, that we did. It related to problem solving. How can we support inclusive practices? What are the barriers? So we would hear, let's say the general ed teachers express how difficult this particular child was, or, well, this particular behavior, what am I going to do? I don't know what to do. And so, well, that's great, because you need, resources, and we need you. We can't come and tell you, inject like with a needle, like, these are your strategies, we expect them done, So it really lent itself, going about it this way, it was really a lot more effective. It took us further. Requests for information, things like, well, what training do we need? And that came up. What areas do we need to address first? In terms of seeking experience, who can we find to help us with this issue? For example, the community member who was a district person specializing in early childhood and assistive technology. No one else had that expertise. And it was so wonderful that he's there, because every time that kind of an issue came up, or when we decided as a group to focus on this, there he was giving us his resources, and we were learning from him. And then he in turn was, we're informing him for his role. What are teachers needing right now? And so that all came up. Reusing assets, what have we done before that worked? A lot of times things come up, why are we reinventing the wheel? Somebody here has faced this with success before. And so we were able to do that. In terms of coordination and synergy, how can we work on this together and come to a shared vision? Discussing developments. What's working? Same kind of a thing. Let's see, you can think of a specific example, but I'm just related to what we're going to do in terms of universal design for learning. That's the thing we sort of picked to share. And that was one topic that folks wanted to come and understand, because it was something for everyone. It was like that whole what's good for everyone, but also what does this child need,
The other thing that we did around like the trainings was we tried to plan them so that the first one was, so that everybody understood what we were talking about when we talked about UDL. And then we paired it with something that was practical and that people could take back to their classrooms. So the first one was around play, where we had them in the training, our meeting together, take a bunch of different toys and actually rate them, which is something we might be doing today with the play rating scale. So that they could work in groups, the groups were mixed, and they could sort of actually use it at that point. Then they were given a universal design for learning environment assessment tool to take back and partner with each other, so that they were looking at the same things together in different environments. Not as a punitive thing, but a sort of like, oh, we are doing some of these things, or we're not doing some of these things. So, then when we then went into assistive technology, which is under the umbrella of universal design. And with assistive technology, we discussed assistive technology, high, medium, low, the whole range of it, but we paired it with early literacy, because that's one of our other charges. So then we had the students and the teachers come in, and we had all kinds of equipment set up and different materials where they went through and then figured out different ways to adapt it and how to use some of the high, low, and medium technology, so that that's something that they could do right then in their classrooms and go back. And that, so that you try to integrate as much as possible, whatever you're doing. So environment, UDL, play, UDL, any of those kinds of topics. But then from the participants came, well, how do we actually get anything assistive tech to the child in the classroom, right? That's the practical thing. You're showing us all these great things, but how do we actually get these things? And so that's where one of our community members is coming in, and he's planned a training on how do you request it? How does it get on the IEP? Who does the assessment? What kind of materials do you need? So in that way, that came out of the teachers' voices when they went through. Granted, a lot of what we started to do came out of what we had to write for the grant. Right.
But it was really, really interesting to pair up an ed specialist teacher candidate with a general ed teacher and have them work on this stuff together. And it was cool because for the gen ed preschool teacher, she's just having someone come in her room and help her with checking out her environment, coming up with ideas in terms of how to make this more accessible, et cetera. And then vice versa, the ed specialist teacher candidate is getting that experience of getting to come into the teacher's classroom, walk through what they do, why they set things up the way that they do, what just a good environment, sort of a general environment looks like, what best practices do they already know. We just tell our students, how can you include, how can you help facilitate inclusion when you don't know what is going on in there? You don't know what the expectations are, you don't know how things work, all of those things. So putting them together to do these documentation projects, to visit each other in that way, that was really, I think, beneficial for them. And then, of course, as they needed us, based on what they were running into, okay, who on our team has that answer or expertise or can get that resource for us? And then there we go. And then the last thing is mapping knowledge and identifying gaps, and that's just what I said right now, which is if we don't have anyone, who do we need to invite into this community of practice? Because we're missing something then, and we need to bring that expertise in.
I also just want to mention that in this particular grant, it supports our students, our early childhood ed specialist candidates through their preliminary credential, but it also supports them through their getting their clear credential. So there is that induction support. So the first cohort, this is only the second year of our grant. So the first cohort is now, all of them have received positions. And so the grant model, we're now trying to support them, and they've now given us needs assessments. And they'll be coming in for second round of trainings with folks, general ed teachers in their schools that they've identified that they would like to train with, and they're in a variety of different settings. So we're extending that that model through that induction part. So that's the teacher advancement and retention part of the grant. That we're not throwing them out to the wolves out there.
And then the other thing I'll add to that is we have the grant money to figure this stuff out, but the goal is sustainability. How do you do this with no money? How did this happen? That's another thing in terms of how you set this up and how you run it. But it's when you have buy-in, because everybody's coming together who has that shared interest, who has that passion to learn and to share and to exchange. You really have people who want to be a part of that anyway. So we're going to just walk you through one of the communities of practice activities that the group embarked on, and that's going to be this UDL. But quickly, for those who sort of haven't run by the definition lately, a systematic approach to designing, environments, curricular content, learning activities and materials that will accommodate the needs of young children with the widest possible range of abilities. This is our goal with implementation. It provides children with a range of functional abilities, the access to everyday learning environments. And it's a way to teach a group of diverse learners in the same classroom without, as we always casually say, stressing out the teacher or dumbing down the curriculum. It's important that we all recognize diversity does not refer only to children with special needs, children with this label, that label, children who are of a particular ethnicity. It's just the idea of what Whit said earlier is that, you know, with the differentiated instruction point that he made, that, you know, we need sort of everyone together, but at the same time, each individual has their own unique needs. And so that's really what universal design for learning gets at. Do you want to walk through this?
Yeah, so when you break down, universal design comes out of architecture, right? So we can thank all our expectant mothers who will soon be wheeling baby strollers, that they don't have to, the automatic doors open up, you know, that elevators are inside the building. I was in a building in Romania, beautiful new school, a French architect, light, absolutely beautiful school, but there's no elevator. And they said they're going to get around to the elevator. They just didn't have enough money. It's harder to put an elevator in after a building is built, right? So it's that thinking ahead when we're designing a space. What do we need in that space for everyone to access? And you know, it was just like, well, they have a lot of different. Sorry, I'm starting to show that I'm a teacher of the deaf on using my hands. So they, you know, that concept is not as prevalent in some of the East Bloc countries, former East Bloc countries. You can tell I grew up in the 60s. 'Cause to me, Bulgaria and Romania were just the Soviet Union, and now I had to find them on the map. Mm-hmm. So it comes out of multiple means of representation. So how many different ways can we provide materials and curriculum? Multiple action and expression. So how many different ways can children express to us that they've learned something or they understand something? It doesn't always have to be the same modality. That there's storytelling, portfolios, acting out, drawing, you know, just so many different ways, communication devices, and then engagement. So provide options for recruiting interest. Some presenters who are here now had an excellent presentation this morning about science and using science in the inclusive classroom and how engaging and motivating science is for children because they're so curious, right? And they're motivated by it. So it's finding those things that are going to help our children be able to sustain efforts, and also looking at almost scaffolding. Is a task too hard for a child or too low, and where do we work with them to keep that interest in there? Okay, so logistically, we weren't quite sure how to do this. Luckily, Suzanne drove up here from Orange County and brought some toys, and I flew in early this morning. But there is on the Edmodo site a universal design for play tool. There's also an article there.
We'll pull it up here on the
We'll
screen.
pull up the tool. And what we are going to do is just pass out some toys and maybe just spend like 10 minutes or so in groups at your tables, going through the tool and seeing how it fits as far as whether it's a toy that we think meets some of the criteria for universal design. So I'll pull up the
Each table can just have one of these and a couple sharks.
Each table.
Yeah. I mean, however many there are, there's 4 of these.
Okay.
So each person can have 4.
Suzanne, where's that? Do you have any questions? Oh, good.
Everyone said they were listening good. Now I just wrote a description to them of the toys that were passed out. And then they can use their imaginations.
Okay. You did? Okay. Do you want to go over the tool?
Okay, so up on the board is the 6 areas that, and I can't make it any bigger. So the toy is appealing. The toy has multiple colors, textures, scents and or sounds. The toy's combination of colors, sounds, textures, and or movements are balanced, so not too much, not too little. How to play with the toy is clear. I can see there's a table back there that's already figured out how to fish. That's cool. The important parts, the knobs, the connectors are highlighted or easy to see or easy to use. The toy does what it's expected to do. So the cow moves and doesn't meow, because that might confuse people. So the toy is easy to use. The toy is easy to pick up. Is easy for children and of different abilities. Toy parts are adequate. The toy requires an adequate amount of effort, so some force or number of rotations. The toy is adjustable, so a variety of actions you can do with that toy. Kind of like, you know, a lot of new toys nowadays, there's only one thing you can do with it. It's kind of disappointing. Toys can be positioned in different ways. The toy allows the child to play with in a variety of positions, on their tummy or in a sling or sitting. And the toy's features, height, speed are adjustable. The toy promotes development. It encourages imagination. This is one that we think is really important, that the toy encourages social play, so that they're not just playing in isolation, but you can set it up so that children would have to talk to each other, or ask for pieces, or do some cooperative learning. The toy promotes discovery and new ways to play. The toy stimulates activities. And the toy can be played with in different ways. So are there other ways that you can play with that toy?
So if we were at the community of practice and we all decided that play was so super important and universal design was so super important, and we wanted to look at that together, so we were going to come together and we're going to check out and do an assessment on the toys we have in our classrooms. And we're going to look at the toys in front of you and on the tables around you, because we didn't have enough for everyone to have multiple toys. But you're going to kind of think about the categories that Janice just read off this tool and talk about, does this toy, you know, meet those criteria? And then talk, as you're talking, about other toys or toys in your classrooms or toys you've seen. Maybe that should stay and be utilized more, maybe things that should go, or how to make one toy more adaptable, so that it's more appropriate for more people. So we're just going to take you through this exercise just to show you the process and have a little fun. Personally, it's like, who wouldn't want to play with Play-Doh, honestly? Right. So go ahead. And then, do you want to join another table? Or?
Yeah, I'd love to. I'm trying to get, sort of get involved in that process down in San Diego, but yeah, definitely love to. All right.
Okay. We're going to bring you back to the group. I used to flash the lights in my classroom for the deaf. Stomp my foot. So at this point, we want to do a little share out. If someone from the table wants to quickly just sort of talk about, especially for our folks that are virtual, what some of the things you came up with and what toy you had. So real brief. I'm going to go through.
If you can't see that, I wrote it again here. Don't know if you can see this, but these were the main categories. So if you want to share things you talked about related to the toy you have or other toys you were talking about, do they meet these criteria?
And raise your hand because we need you to be on the mic.
We sort of collaborated over here. We had the sandwich components. We had the bread and cheese and lettuce and so I would say appealing. I mean, we just had lunch, so I wouldn't say it was really appealing. And it's plastic. The use was pretty clear because of the Velcro. You kind of had it, you more or less just taking Velcro and putting them together. So I would say clear use, easy to use, yes. Adjustable, definitely adjustable, because we could take, we took the sort of the hoagie rolls, and then we took the sandwich. I didn't see any wheat breads, which I was a bit disappointed, you know.
But you can make a vegan or a vegetarian sandwich with this toy, so I'm just saying, it's a good one. Gluten-free, see, lettuce wrap.
It definitely promoted development and different use, depending on your
Imagination?
your preference.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Another table. Yes, in the back, thank you.
Well, our toy was Play-Doh, and boy, talk about something that 0 to 99 ages like. So we really felt that it met a lot of the criteria. Regardless of developmental levels, there's some way to interact with it, but really focusing on one of the things that you talked about was the social play, and there's just so many different things you could do with it. Whether you decide as a group to build something, so everybody does their part, or sharing out what you've built and describing it. So definitely flexible, portable, you can use it anywhere. So we thought it was met a lot of the criteria.
And do you want to add Play-Doh? Yeah.
We agreed with almost everything about the Play-Doh itself, but I'm not sure if you guys had the cutters with yours. We decided that the cutters actually did not fit most of these. So whereas Play-Doh is extremely flexible and almost every kid seems to like it instinctively, the cutters are kind of prescriptive. There's not much you can do with them. Even though these ones are nice and thick, it still might be difficult for some kids to use. They cut only part of it, and then they don't actually have the fish. And then what do you do with the fish once you have the fish cut? So we actually said that we really like Play-Doh, but we don't like cutters.
Okay, so maybe the importance of having a number of different options, like the knife, the rolling pin, I know for my daughter, the squeezy thing to make it shoot out, that was always way too difficult to push through, so that was lame. And that is a very professional scholarly term. So continue using it. But I think that what you said about the social, I love that you brought that up, because it's one of my favorite things to do. It's such a simple thing, and yet no one really thinks to do it very often. And when I go into a classroom, what we'll see is you see the Play-Doh table, right? And it's a huge free-for-all. I mean, and the kids just play, but do they have to interact? Usually it's a lot of just parallel playing. Everyone's got their own thing, and there's plenty enough to go around, and so everyone has their own Play-Doh and their own knife and their own scissor and their own whatever, shape cutters. But simply trying to arrange the materials so that it's not a big dump where there's so many pieces, no one ever needs to even work together. And facilitating some kind of idea, hey, why don't you guys decide what you might want to build together? Or even just manipulating the materials so that, well, there's one knife and it's on that side, and there's one scissor and that person has it, and there's one rolling pin and it's over here. So now they have to actually talk or communicate in some way in order to play. And so even making simple manipulations with the toy can bring about a social activity where before there was no social interaction going on at all. So especially, obviously it depends on the kiddos and what they're able to or interested in pretending and how you can add to toys. But we always encourage folks, you don't have to follow the directions on the box. Use the material for any wonderful thing you can think of, really.
I think, when you look at, I'm sorry.
Only because of the mic.
Okay. When you look at these things, at this age, you want to encourage explorations, and you want the experiences to be provocative. And so, what better way to spark the interest? And when we talk about the whole Common Core, and we talk about Bloom's taxonomy, we want to get kids to start to be inquisitive, ask questions, because now there's an open container, and so they're ready to learn. So I think that these activities sort of spark that discussion.
Thank you for that. Is something someone want to add to what we're saying, or moving on to the next question, which is, did you guys talk about any toys that weren't meeting sort of a UDL criteria? If you want to share that. I know I see you guys nodding, and I see you guys nodding. So someone at this table or that table?
So we talked about talking about social emotional needs, this might be for some students exercise in frustration tolerance, because if you don't have the magnet perfectly in sync with the receiving magnet, it's really quite difficult to grasp. So that was one aspect. And then we talked about perhaps these could be in a different medium, whether it's kind of a water tray or a sand tray that kind of props them up to help kids. So we talked in that fashion. Then I just thought, when you mentioned any way that kids can use toys, I have some kids who might think these are lightsabers. So I might have to reel back on that, but no pun intended with that.
And I love that. And it can, adding, you could use the fish separately than the fishing pole, like you said. You can add other things in, so it's not just the hard ones, because I know that's so frustrating, but maybe bigger magnet pieces or letters with magnets. But yeah, you're talking about adaptations, right? So that there's something for everyone. And now play can be really special for everyone in the classroom. Do you want to talk about this, or did you?
I was just going to mention one more thing with the sandwiches, that our community, when they actually, the cohort 2 explored this a couple weeks ago, they decided that they could use the sandwich building not only just in the kitchen area and stuff, but that they could make sequencing almost a game out of it. So almost like a Go Fish, like, do you have the tomato? And everyone each child would have maybe a picture of what their sandwich is supposed to look like at the end, and then they had to ask for the pieces one way or the other. So that was how they came up with making it maybe a little bit more exciting of a toy, and then also bringing in that social part of it. So that was one of the things they did.
Pretending Subway, right?
Right.
Ordering your sandwich.
Right. Then then as I go into literacy, then you could have menus, and then there's the numeracy, you have money and the counting. It's like one little sandwich kit, not that exciting, 100 different opportunities. So in my next life, I'll just be one of those people that comes into a classroom and tells you how many times what you can do with that product.
I just wondered if there's access to that universal design for Play 2?
Yeah, it's on the
Edmodo.
It's on the
In
Edmodo
our
site.
session, we posted
Right.
the tool.
And I can also post on there, send a post out. It comes out of Let's Play, the University of Buffalo.
Did you talk about this?
We didn't. We sort of talked about part of looking at developmentally appropriate practice and UDL and accommodations stems out of this sort of unified theory of practice. Odom and Woolery have a great article that they wrote about this unified theory between ECE and ECSE, and they pretty much have said, before the word community practice suddenly has come into our vernacular, they talked about the blended program, training together, hearing and learning at the same time what the importance of these issues are at some point, so that we're not in silos. And I refer to their work often, especially when I'm writing grants. Then Cook, Klein, and Chen have a great book out about general instructional strategies for supporting inclusion and inclusive practices that would make actually a nice book if you are in a community of practice for everyone to have or to share. Learning is accessible to every learner. We kind of went through that. Children learn best from materials and activities that are not too far beyond their developmental level of the child. And we see that often in programs when the child's behavior is mainly stemming out of the fact that they're frustrated because they can't get the magnet, or the activity is too hard for them, and instead of figuring out how to still have them participate and do the activity, we often penalize them for it. And so we have to really look at that environment and where that zone of proximal development is. And then the motivation and engagement. There's some work being done on the East Coast. They presented last year at the DEC conference, and I'm sorry I've been up early this morning and I forgot, but I can also post that link, where they're doing project-based learning, and they're doing project-based learning within inclusive programs, and they're having amazing results because every child's interest and their engagement happens in that naturalistic setting. So they'll do it around, and the children determine what they're gonna do. They started out with tree houses and where animals live, and it just kind of exponentially went from that, and the children did some amazing work. They still learned their colors, they still learned how to sequence, they still learned the letters and numbers, but it wasn't the letter of the week. It was around what they were doing. And so really looking at the social mediation of experiences where it is relevant, culturally relevant for the children in their neighborhood, and they're bringing experiences that they've had. Every child comes to school with an experience, and sometimes we sort of discount that. Like we forget that they have a home and they've had 3 years of life before that time, and they know things that we need to know that they know. And then it helps facilitate adult-child communication, and then project-based learning more naturalistic. So those are some ways to really take some of these principles and put them into action.
And you can see how this kind of activity or issue can be relevant across the fields of general and special education. So last, we're just going to conclude with wrapping up how these steps toward establishing a community of practice went, because obviously we're going to look at, we're sharing with you what we did. You're here experiencing what Santa Clara is doing, and then how are you going to go home and maybe start a community in your own entity. So, number one, identify important issues and invite participants. Think about organizations that might provide entry points for new participants. Explain why they should be involved. Plan concrete ways for organizations and new groups to move forward together with existing community participants. And this is all from Cashman and colleagues. Number two, engage participants in the process of sharing and exchanging information and taking joint actions. You're going to want to acknowledge the value of each stakeholder, maintain a transparent agenda, and working jointly together because it develops trust. Conduct joint conferences and trainings, and determine next steps as a group. Number three, create opportunities for communication, understanding each other's needs and abilities, and developing that shared language we talked about. So it's an alignment. You're aligning as a group, and you're learning from each other. And then the last one, facilitate ongoing and deeper connections. This is a long-term thing. This isn't like a task force where you come, knock it out, and you're done. This is an ongoing, long-term, and growing thing. So you want to keep the focus on shared interests and not allow tangents really to creep in where only some of the members or a few of the members are interested. It's really keeping that work around joint issues. And Cashman says coalesce around the issues. Create opportunities for observing and sharing one's own practice. Anything from stories to share to classroom observations, products, strategies. Develop an interactive process for gathering input and sharing information. Is that what Edmodo is all about? Articulate what all participants have gained. Leaders are coaches. They're not dictators, right? And they make, and you want to make products easily available for all.
So we'll leave you with this quote. The potential for practitioners and researchers to construct knowledge exists in this model because communities of practice represent an ongoing enterprise that invites both groups to share, build upon, and transform what they know about effective practices.
And that's what we'll leave you with. So thank you for joining us today.
And any questions? We have some questions.
Oh, my question is maybe a little bit tangential to the conversation, but I think it connects. So you were talking about the teachers now in the CLEAR program. They're in a variety of settings, and they're pairing with early childhood teachers still.
Some of them.
Some of them. So one of my questions was, are they moving? So if they are in an SDC program, are you finding that they're trying to move their program to inclusion?
They are. I feel like we have a little army of people that we've done some good work, and they're being very creative about how they go about and do that, and they're finding many different barriers. And because we've had them in this community of practice before, and we've talked about different barriers and identified them, they're not as stuck in the barriers. They're finding different ways to go about it, and some of them are very small ways, but they share on the online forum, so they still have each other as a collaborative, and then I encourage them to form, take the community of practice idea and try to institute that within their own school.
Okay, and that was one of my questions too. Is
Correct.
that part of the CLEAR program, helping them form their own community of practice?
Yes.
Okay.
And they're also involved in action research, and most of them are doing action research involved around some sort of inclusive practice, even down to training their paraprofessionals in different ways to support children out in the playground in that area. So it's been interesting, this sort of web. We don't know how it's going to go. So, good question.
Mine's a little more logistical. I was just wondering if you have a reference list or a resource list for all the literature that you referenced. It'd be interesting to read some of those things, but it was just the names, not actually, where to find it.
Yes, we'll put a thing up and figure out how to get it. We have to send it to somebody to get up to Edmodo to
That'd be
share.
great. That'd be great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
We were saying earlier that we're not used to not being able to control our information. So as professors, we are very, So yes, we will get all those up there. Perfect. Good question. Should have been at the end. Okay. Thank you. Well, great. I hope you guys have a great rest of the conference, and thank you for listening to us.